California in the late 1960s was electric with possibility. The world was changing fast, loud, and barefoot, and this sun-drenched coast became its golden stage. From the misty hills of San Francisco to the neon pulse of Los Angeles, young people flocked westward with backpacks, guitars, and wide, searching eyes. They chased a feeling they couldn't always name: freedom, transcendence, rebellion, or maybe just a place to breathe. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and sandalwood. Psychedelic rock spilled from open windows. Volkswagen vans rolled down palm-lined streets, painted with peace signs and protest slogans. Haight-Ashbury was a living collage of tie-dye, incense, and idealism. Venice Beach buzzed with poets, street performers, and barefoot prophets. They pitched tents in Golden Gate Park, danced under moonlight at Griffith Park, passed joints in drum circles, and scrawled manifestos on the backs of napkins. Turn on, tune in, drop out wasn't just a slogan, it was a sermon. People weren't just dropping acid, they were dropping expectations. In the haze of flower power, anti-war marches, and endless sunsets, California became a dreamscape, where reality bent like heat waves on asphalt and anything felt possible, until it wasn't. It was paradise, or so it seemed. But paradise, left unchecked, invites its shadows. Amid the swirl of psychedelic colors and the soundtrack of revolution, a darker melody began to play. For every searcher looking for truth, there was someone ready to offer it, for a price. When rules disappear, so do boundaries. And without boundaries, even love can become a weapon. In this state of openness and yearning, cults began to bloom like wildflowers. At first, beautiful, strange, and full of promise. But hidden beneath the petals were thorns, and some of those thorns were deadly. They went by names like the family, the source, Cinanon, children of God. Some promised salvation, others offered eternal life, or healing, or cosmic truth. But what they all had in common was a single charismatic leader and a group of people willing to give up everything to follow them. Charles Manson was one of the first. He wore the same long hair and beads as the dreamers around him, sang songs about peace and love, and preached about a coming revolution. But Manson's dream was soaked in blood. His cult would turn the bright hopes of the counterculture into a national nightmare. And he wasn't alone. California's spiritual explosion birthed more than just movements. It bred messiahs. It created kingdoms ruled by fear in the name of love. And for those caught inside, the line between utopia and hell blurred until it vanished. This is the story of the cults that grew out of California's golden soil, their promises, their poison, and the people who lived through them. It's the story of how the search for something higher became a descent into the darkest corners of the human soul. In the years after World War II, California became the American dream with a coastline. It was a place of invention and reinvention where everything felt new and nothing felt impossible. By the time the 1960s arrived, it wasn't just a destination, it was a symbol. Surfboards, convertibles, sunshine, and space to breathe. But beneath the golden sky, something deeper stirred. The young were growing restless. Their parents had lived by rules: go to school, get a job, build a life behind white picket fences. But for a new generation raised on rock music and revolution, those rules felt like chains. So they ran. They ran from draft notices, from suburbs, from expectations. And many of them ran west until they couldn't run any farther. California was waiting. Los Angeles and San Francisco transformed into magnets for wanderers and truth seekers. They brought poetry and protest, acid trips and anti-war chants. In the Haight-Ashbury district, hippies piled into cramped apartments and open-door communes. They shared food, ideas, partners. They gave each other new names, burned their IDs, and turned their backs on a world they believed was built on lies. Music echoed from every street corner. The air smelled like incense and marijuana. Strangers hugged like family. And on every wall, messages scrawled in chalk. Love is all you need. Make love, not war. The age of Aquarius is here. For a while, it felt like paradise, but paradise with no structure can quickly become chaos. Many who arrived with flowers in their hair ended up broke, addicted, or lost. And in that fog of confusion and craving, something dangerous began to stir. Not everyone in California was looking to be saved. Some were looking for people who wanted to be saved, people who would listen, believe, obey. These weren't con artists in suits or politicians behind podiums. These were the new messiahs, barefoot, wide-eyed, and smooth-tongued. They didn't preach fear. They offered family, purpose, a path. In a land bursting with hope, these figures stepped in like shepherds. But the sheep didn't realize they were being led straight into darkness. Charles Manson was already watching. He saw the hunger, he saw the loneliness, and he knew exactly what to do with it. Before the world knew his name, Charles Manson was a drifter. Born in 1934 to a teenage mother, passed between relatives and institutions, he spent more years behind bars than in a classroom. He was small, wiry, with sharp eyes, and a voice that could flip from soft to snarling in a heartbeat. He never belonged anywhere until he arrived in California. By the mid-60s, Manson had traded prison walls for the Pacific Coast Highway. He spoke in riddles and parables, strumming a guitar like a prophet in a denim robe. He claimed he'd found the truth, and if you listened long enough, if you let the acid hit and the fear fall away, it started to make sense. At least, it did to the ones who stayed. He called them his family, but there were no blood ties. Just broken young women and aimless men drawn to Manson's magnetic chaos. He didn't scream or threaten, not at first. He loved, he accepted, he filled the holes they didn't know they had. To those on the outside, they were just another group of hippies, another commune tucked into the dusty California hills. But on the inside, a new world was being built, one where Charlie was God. They lived on the edge of society, scavenging food, stealing cars, crawling through dumpsters, and surviving on scraps and songs. Manson preached about race wars and the collapse of civilization. He called it helter-skelter, twisting Beatles lyrics into prophecy. He told them the world was ending, that they would survive underground, and that when the ashes settled, they would rule what remained. At Spawn Ranch, a crumbling movie set in the desert, they danced under the stars and waited for the end. The girls wore flowing dresses and vacant smiles. The boys took orders without question. Manson gave them new names and erased their pasts. He told them nothing mattered but him, that he was the only truth they'd ever need. And then came the shift. Love turned into control. Sex became currency. Loyalty meant surrendering everything. Dissent became betrayal. And the dream, once sun-soaked and free, curdled into something violent. What started as a family became a cult, and what began as a vision turned into a plan for blood. While Charles Manson was vanishing into the shadows of the Mojave, another figure stood in the sunlight, bathed in white robes and the scent of sandalwood. His name was Father Yod, or at least that's what he called himself. To outsiders, he was a former judo champion and a restaurateur. To his followers, he was a spiritual father, the voice of the universe, and the embodiment of God on earth. His empire didn't begin in the desert, but on Sunset Boulevard, inside a restaurant called The Source. It wasn't just a health food cafe, it was the Health Food Cafe. Celebrities, rock stars, models, and seekers all gathered there, sipping carrot juice and flirting with enlightenment. Behind the counter, in flowing linen with a long white beard, was the man who claimed to have unlocked the secrets of the cosmos. Father Yod's real name was Jim Baker, but he'd shed that identity the way his followers shed their worldly attachments. He preached ancient wisdom laced with Eastern mysticism, astrology, and the writings of the occult. His message was fluid, evolving, and often impossible to pin down. But in the haze of incense and spiritual yearning, it didn't have to make perfect sense. It only had to feel right. And for the young people who followed him, many of them fresh out of high school, drawn by the promise of cosmic truth and unconditional love, feeling was everything. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Source. Dozens lived together in a mansion in the Hollywood Hills, practicing meditation, singing, making music, and surrendering themselves to Father Yod's guidance. There were no clocks, no rules, no jobs, just ritual, harmony, and the presence of their leader. But behind the serenity was a current of control. Father Yod had multiple spiritual wives, some barely of age. His teachings, though peaceful on the surface, often made him the unquestioned center of all things. He recorded albums with the group, psychedelic hymns that sounded like transmissions from another dimension, and declared that he alone knew the way forward. In 1974, sensing a shift in energy, or perhaps pressure from the outside, he led the Brotherhood to Hawaii, seeking a new paradise. But there, the spell began to break. The structure of their commune crumbled. The magic faded, and one morning, Father Yod climbed into a hang glider despite having no experience. He crashed to his death on the beach, leaving behind confusion, grief, and a legacy as strange as it was sacred. Unlike Manson, Father Yod didn't leave behind carnage. His was a cult wrapped in silk and song, in raw vegan food and whispered mantras. But like all the others, it revealed the same truth. In a time of searching, a man with enough charisma could convince people that he was the answer. Long before they became a footnote in television specials and late-night punchlines, the members of Heaven's Gate believed they were preparing for the most important journey of their lives. It wasn't just death they were chasing, it was transcendence. A place aboard a spacecraft, hidden behind a comet, a ticket out of this corrupted world and into the next level. But to understand how they got there, you have to go back to the beginning, before the black robes and matching sneakers, when two lost souls met and decided they were divine. In the early 1970s, Marshall Applewhite was a music teacher who had lost his job and his grip on reality. Bonnie Nettles was a nurse and a mother, with a growing obsession with prophecy and the stars. When they met in Texas, something clicked. They believed they were chosen, that they had known each other in past lives. Together, they were the two, spiritual messengers sent to earth to guide a select few toward salvation. They left behind their old lives, adopting new names, doing tea, like the musical notes, and hit the road in a beat-up car, preaching a gospel of alien messiahs and interplanetary ascension. To most, they sounded insane, but to some, their message sparked a strange recognition. Maybe it was the intensity in their eyes. Maybe it was the timing. So many people still drifting from the chaos of the 60s, still hungry for meaning. Slowly, they began to gather followers. Unlike other cults, Heaven's Gate wasn't about drugs, sex, or even communal living at first. It was about purity, celibacy, self-denial. They believed the body was a mere vehicle, a shell that needed to be perfected, abandoned, and left behind. The earth, they said, was about to be recycled, and only those who had detached from human ways would be allowed to board the next vessel to salvation. They moved often, living in near silence, hidden from view, waiting for the sign. Some castrated themselves to quiet earthly urges. They watched science fiction films like Star Trek and Close Encounters not for entertainment, but as coded messages. And at the center of it all stood Applewhite, now simply Do, his eyes wide, his tone soothing, his grip absolute. Then, in 1997, the Hale-Bopp comet appeared in the night sky, a glowing omen above the Earth. Doe told them it was time. The spacecraft they had always waited for was now behind the comet, hidden from sight, waiting to take them home. On March 26th, 39 members of Heaven's Gate were found dead in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. They had eaten identical meals, taken poison, and laid down in rows, covered neatly with purple shrouds. Their faces were calm. Their bags were packed. They believed they were leaving Earth behind. There was no violence, no coercion in the traditional sense, just a slow, methodical surrender to an idea so far removed from reality, it could only survive in total isolation. Heaven's Gate didn't begin as a suicide cult. It began as a promise that you weren't alone, that you were chosen, and that this world, messy, cruel, and confusing, wasn't your true home. That was the trap, and it worked. It started with good intentions. In the late 1950s, Charles Dedrick, a hard-drinking salesman from Ohio, sobered up and wanted to help others do the same. He wasn't a doctor, and he wasn't trained in therapy, but he had something else, a powerful presence and a vision. He called it Cinanon. At first, it was a rehab center like no other. No clinical setting, no white coats, just addicts talking to addicts in raw, unfiltered sessions they called The Game. In The Game, members would sit in circles and verbally tear each other down, exposing secrets, ego, weakness. They said it was therapy. Dedrick said it was salvation. And for a while, it worked. Junkies got clean. Criminals found purpose. Cinanon grew. By the mid-60s, the little recovery group had transformed into something bigger, a movement. They had buildings, businesses, a bustling compound in Santa Monica. Reporters called it a miracle. Politicians praised it. Celebrities dropped by. Dedrick stood at the center of it all, beaming with messianic pride. But the more Cinanon expanded, the more it changed. It stopped being just a place to get clean. It became a way of life. Members were told to cut ties with family, abandon outside careers, and surrender themselves to the community. They wore matching uniforms, lived under strict rules, children were raised communally, often without their parents. Dedrick's words were law, and he had begun to believe he was something more than a man. By the 1970s, Cinanon was no longer a rehab. It was a cult. Dedrick, often drunk and increasingly paranoid, declared Cinanon an experimental society. He ordered forced vasectomies for male members. Wives and husbands were reassigned by decree. Critics and defectors were labeled enemies, and then the violence began. In 1978, a lawyer named Paul Morantz, who had challenged Cinanon in court, opened his mailbox and was nearly killed by a rattlesnake. Its rattle had been removed. The message was clear. Cinanon no longer healed. It punished. Underneath the slogans of recovery and self-improvement, Cinanon had become a closed system, fueled by fear and loyalty. It operated like a militia, with weapons, drills, and an internal police force. Members no longer questioned the beatings, the surveillance, the silence. They were told it was part of the process, that this was the only place where truth existed. Eventually, the walls cracked. Investigations mounted. Dedrick was arrested. Cinanon, once a beacon of hope for addicts, collapsed under the weight of its own madness. What began as salvation ended in threats and snakes in the mail. Another California dream turned nightmare. Because when power goes unchecked, and when belief becomes obedience, even the brightest intentions can rot into something monstrous. In a decade defined by love and liberation, no one wore the mask of purity quite like the children of God. Their name alone sounded peaceful, biblical, almost innocent. But behind the hymns and smiling faces was a story soaked in manipulation, abuse, and a darkness that preyed on the very idea of trust. It began with a man named David Berg, a former pastor who believed he had been chosen to deliver a new gospel, one tailored for a world unraveling at the seams. He didn't want to save souls through sermons. He wanted revolution, spiritual, sexual, and absolute. His message was simple: the system was evil, religion was corrupt, and only through him could people find the real truth. In the chaos of the late 60s, that was all some needed to hear. Berg's followers, many of them teenagers and runaways, called him Moses David. They left behind families, jobs, homes. They took new names, wore flowing clothes, sang songs in public parks. They hitchhiked across America, spreading the word, handing out literature, offering salvation, and smiles. On the surface, it looked like love. But inside the communes, the rules were changing. Berg preached free love, but it wasn't the kind being celebrated at music festivals. His doctrine twisted affection into obligation. Women were told their bodies were tools for recruiting. It became known as flirty fishing, seduction as a form of evangelism. New converts were often pulled in, not by ideology, but by intimacy. Sex became scripture, consent blurred, boundaries dissolved. And then came the children, raised inside isolated compounds across the world. Many never saw the outside world. They didn't go to school. They didn't watch TV. Their education came from Berg's writings, thousands of letters filled with prophecy, paranoia, and sexual confusion. Discipline was harsh. Dissent was forbidden, and in the shadows, abuse took root. Former members would later speak of beatings, of grooming, of being taught that love meant surrender. That trust meant silence. The innocence of childhood, laughter, wonder, safety, was slowly, cruelly stripped away. All in the name of God. By the 1980s and 90s, cracks began to show. Media investigations exposed the darker side of the group. Lawsuits followed. Berg, hidden away in secrecy, continued to write until his death in 1994. But even after his passing, the group, now rebranded as the Family International, struggled to separate from its past. The Children of God didn't end in a mass suicide or fiery standoff. Their tragedy was quieter, more insidious. It lived in the memories of the survivors, those who grew up inside, who escaped, and who spent years piecing themselves back together. It wasn't just a cult, it was a betrayal of everything sacred. And in that betrayal, a generation of children lost what they never had a chance to know: freedom. By the end of the 1970s, California had become more than a place. It was an idea. Sunshine, freedom, new beginnings, a paradise with wide beaches, winding roads, and space to disappear. For generations, people had come west chasing gold, fame, or reinvention. But in the haze of post-war prosperity and counterculture rebellion, something darker took root beneath the golden glow. This was a time of upheaval. The dream of the 60s, peace, love, revolution, had curdled. Vietnam was a scar that never quite healed. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy shattered the illusion of moral progress. And as Watergate unraveled trust in government, faith in traditional authority crumbled. Institutions no longer offered comfort. Families fractured, churches felt hollow. People began looking elsewhere for answers. California, always open-armed, became the testing ground for the spiritual and the strange. Yoga studios and psychic parlors lined the same blocks as churches. Posters promised cosmic awareness. LSD whispered secrets no preacher could offer. And in the empty spaces between mainstream faith and New Age mysticism, the cults crept in. They didn't call themselves cults, of course. They were movements, fellowships, brotherhoods. They offered clarity and confusion, family for the lonely, and purpose for the aimless. They gave people something to belong to. In a world spinning faster than anyone could understand, that promise was intoxicating. Most seekers didn't know what they were joining. They came with open hearts and left with open wounds. In California, with its deserts and coasts and transient spirit, made it easy to hide, easy to grow, and easy to fall under someone else's spell. What united these cults wasn't their theology, it was their timing. They arrived when people were desperate for meaning and found themselves in the vacuum of disillusionment. When trust faded, when tradition failed, when the old answers stopped working, all it took was one person, charismatic, confident, unshakably certain, to offer a new way. The question was never why people followed, it was why they wouldn't. In the right moment, with the right words, anyone might have said yes. The world beyond the cults moved on. It had to. News cycles turned, public outrage faded, and the quiet survivors of these strange experiments in faith and control were left to rebuild their shattered lives. But for those who'd lived through the horror, who'd watched friends and lovers vanish into the fog of fanaticism, who'd survived the physical and emotional abuse, time never healed. The scars were always there, hidden beneath the skin, etched into the marrow of their bones. Survivors didn't always speak. Some, too afraid of retaliation, remained silent for years. Others were too damaged to find their voices. And then there were those who had never truly escaped. Even after they left, the teachings lingered in their heads, the chants echoing like distant thunder. The ties that had bound them to these men and women, these false gods, never truly broke. They haunted their thoughts, their relationships, their very sense of self. For every survivor, there was a story of broken trust, of being used, manipulated, lied to. Some left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a lifetime of guilt. Many tried to warn others, but their voices were often drowned in the noise of a world that preferred not to remember. What did they learn? It's a question many of them still ask themselves. They had believed in something larger than life, something that offered clarity. But in the end, what was larger than life turned out to be a lie. In a world where truth was fluid and trust was a commodity, they had been taught to worship a distorted reality, to follow where they were led, no matter the cost. But for some, there was redemption. They found new faith in themselves, in their families, in simple moments of quiet peace. They rebuilt their lives, brick by brick, sometimes with the help of those who had been there too. Others never found peace. They spent years piecing together the fragments of their past, each fragment sharp and jagged. The cults have long since faded, their leaders gone or imprisoned, but the ripples remain. The lessons of those years, the dangers of blind obedience, the cost of misplaced trust, the vulnerability of human souls seeking answers, linger, silent but present. In California, it still beckons. The Golden State still draws the lost, the broken, the dreamers. The world still spins, the sun still rises. But as the decades stretch on, we're left to ask, how much of the madness was inevitable? And how much of it was born from the very soil of California itself? In the end, it's not the names we remember, the Manson family, Father Yod, Heaven's Gate. It's the faces of those who followed them, the faces that trusted, the faces that wanted to believe. They are the echoes of the unanswered. If you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying the story. If you're interested in more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a great story. This is Liam. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.